All right, good morning. How y'all doing? Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. So welcome to the Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science in the home of the James C. Kennedy Waterfowl and Wetland Conservation Center. I am Jim Anderson. I'm the director of the Kennedy Center. And the Kennedy Center's goal is to lead in science and education to sustain waterfowl and wetlands of South Atlantic coastal ecosystems and train future waterfowl and wetland ecologists and managers. So today's program by Dr. Phil Lavretsky and initiated by Mark Johnson from the Palmetto Waterfowl Conservation contributes to our mission of promoting sound science. So thank you, Mark, for initiating this program. We appreciate that. I also want to recognize Crystal Anderson, no relation to me, but for organizing all of this. So thank you. Thank you, Crystal. And so it's great to see all of you this morning. I appreciate you coming out to share our passion for mallards and other waterfowl resources. So glad you all found breakfast. And hope you are enjoying that. And so our guest speaker today is Dr. Philip Lavretsky, who received his PhD from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio in 2014. His dissertation focused on the genetics of mallard-like ducks. So he's an associate professor and he runs a wildlife-focused population genetics lab at the University of Texas El Paso since 2016. His research spans across evolutionary, population, and conservation genomic disciplines. You can explain all that to them later.
That's right.
And then as well as field-based approaches to develop important methods to be implemented towards wildlife management. He also led the South Carolina specific mallard DNA analysis that many of you participated in and know about during this past season. So he's published numerous research and popular articles detailing his work. And then one of those appears in the current issue of Ducks Unlimited magazine. There's copies of that out here on the table. If you did not get a copy, please make sure you take a copy of that before you go. So please help me welcome Dr. Lavretsky.
All right. Morning, everybody. This has been a bit of a whirlwind. So this is my 7th time presenting in like 3 days. So I've been all over the state. It's a wonderful state, mostly backwoods, and getting to see the country and what the ducks are sort of trying to come back into. So yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about the things we learned here for South Carolina. I want to note that this is the first time, as far as I know, that we've attempted a project at this scale with hunter donations and hunter participation across all the flyways. And I know that there's several other states that are already considering a similar project, and we're using what we learned here in South Carolina to start advising what we're going to do in other parts of the country. So yeah, so I run a wildlife genetics lab, but we basically do everything under the sun. So we catch birds, we do habitat assessments, we do telemetry work, but we basically sprinkle genetics on everything. And for us, that has been, profoundly different, right? So we actually have figured out what we're really working with. You can look at something and think it's that, but really genetics is the only thing, in my opinion, that doesn't lie in life. So one of the facets to my work is understanding hybridization, right? The interbreeding of different populations and what that means for both evolutionary stuff, but also for conservation. And I want to make note that there's, what is hybridization? What are the kind of management consequences of those situations? So here you have hybridization where you have a mallard and an American black duck making this hybrid. Now, if that hybrid was a mule, right? So it didn't survive or have kids, management-wise, this is lost breeding potential. We should have had a nest of mallards and we should have had a nest of black ducks, but we came up with a nest of individuals that do not contribute into future generations. And what this would be is an acute response to this interbreeding of individuals, right? You're basically losing individuals for the future. What gene flow is hybridization, but let's say that hybrid is actually fertile to some extent and is able to survive to some extent, and they're able to breed back into one or both of their parent species. In this case, they're essentially a vessel of black duck and mallard genetics, and they can move black duck genetics into mallard or mallard genetics into black duck, depending on who they interbreed with. This actually moves genes, and this is generationally a problem because it's a slow decay of genetic integrity that is adapted to the local area. So the individuals slowly become less acute to, it's time to migrate, it's time to feed, how do I feed, where do I go, when do I nest? These types of things that have been adapted over eons start to break down. So this is a problem across generations. All right, so if you don't know this, the mallard is part of this mallard complex, or a mallard slam, as I call it. The mallard is the only one that's found holarctically, so they're found in North America and Eurasia. The rest of the 13 species are found worldwide, but specific to continents or islands. Here in North America, we obviously have the Mexican duck, two types of mottled duck, Florida and Western Gulf Coast. You guys here actually have Western Gulf Coast mottled ducks, American black ducks, and of course, the mallard. But over the last 5 years, I haven't been able to talk about that complex. There is a secondary complex to the story, which is a domestic mallard complex. If you don't know this, the mallard was one of the last successful domestication events by people, starting by the Ming Dynasty in 500 BC or so. And ever since then, everybody sort of, got on that bandwagon and made all sorts of domestic breeds, right? We all know the Pekin ducks. If you ever gone to a restaurant and had duck, you probably ate one of these ducks. But of course, whether it's meat production or egg production or fanciness, it's sort of like our dog breeds, right? People are picking and choosing the traits that they want over a long period of time. And one of those breeds is known as a game farm mallard. I use the term game farm mallard because that's what it's called. It's sort of saying like, that's a lab. And the traits of this bird were started by, as far as I can tell, by King Charles II in 1650. The use of the word game farm mallard was first noted by the Brits in 1890 when they were banding these things and putting them out on the landscape. And so this thing has been more or less derived for the last 150 to 450 years. They've been in this domestic captive setting. But they've also been introduced worldwide. Everywhere where people went, they've been introduced. And the thought in those introductions, including the way I was taught, is that they didn't do anything, right? They didn't survive or interbreed with anybody, so it's all good. You're just getting more birds in the air. But no matter where I went and where I sampled, whether I'm in New Zealand, Hawaii, Africa, North America, I kept finding their babies on the landscape. So this told me that they actually did something. About 8 years ago, that's where that graph is from. I was like, what is that? And what you're looking at is the genetic ancestry as a principal component analysis. Doesn't really matter what that means. If the balls are closer together, they're more genetically similar. The farther apart the balls are, the more genetically different they are. And anything in the middle would be genetic intermediates or hybrids in this case. So we're going to get into North America. So that's what it looked like when I first started studying. I was like, I wonder what that is. But ever since we've worked across islands, right? So this is Hawaii. Red is known domestic mallard. In our 23 paper, we figured out that is game farm derived. I thought it would be park duck, but it's actually game farm derived. Mallards, wild mallards, are all the way up on top there, so you can see how different they are. And then Hawaiian ducks, and then those blue dots in the middle are all the hybrids. And this is New Zealand, right? You still have a big feral population there of mallards. You have the endemic species, which is the New Zealand gray duck, part of the Pacific black duck group. And then you've got tons of hybrids, right? All the stuff in the middle. So let's take a look at North America, right? So North America, I was like, all right, how do we figure out what is occurring, right? I knew the history behind North American stocking practices here. And if you don't know this, we really didn't have mallards in the northeast part of this country where it was true boreal forest until really the 1920s. And in the 1920s, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, well, what was U.S. Fish and Wildlife at the time, state agencies and private individuals wanted to start breeding individuals. Now, again, this is at the tail end of market hunting and population crashes. So everybody wanted to create more stuff anyways. And they did try it with wild mallards and wild black ducks, but production of wild birds is often hampered because they don't want to produce. And so somebody must have known that the Europeans had been refining this over a couple hundred years because that's what they brought over. And so my question was, how bad is this? Genetically, at least. And so, we did a study published in last year, 2,000 samples, pretty much, all the flyways. We really focused on the Atlantic and Mississippi flyways. But then I got my European colleagues to get me birds out of representation across a bunch of countries there. We have our feral populations that are in New Zealand and Hawaii, and we did a bunch of genetic analyses with these birds, right? One of the questions that we wanted to ask is, what is the maternal lineage here in North America? I'm just going to put this up, and it looks like a whole bunch of balls and sticks and stuff like that, but each ball you can consider as a unique female lineage. The size of the ball is the number of birds that represent that haplotype or female lineage. And there's always this question, right? There's these two primary divergent lineages. One is primarily found in Eurasia. They're called Old World. And one is primarily found in North America amongst our black ducks and mottled ducks and Mexican ducks and mallards. And it's called New World. But here in North America, we also have Old World. And for a very long time, the question was, how did it get here, right? Was it natural? Was it unnatural? Was it always here? What was that question? So what you want to see is this. You want to see lots of little balls all connected. This is lots of females breeding on the landscape, highly diverse females breeding on the landscape. So wild mallards in Eurasia and in North America have lots of diversity. When we look at the females that comprise this group, this is all what I find in feral populations of game farm mallards, 14 different, basically eaves, as you could consider them, that were derived and brought all over the world, both here in North America, Eurasia. You can see the color coding. It's essentially found no matter where I look, right? Those are the same female lineages over and over. That's what domestication does. That's what your breeding schemes do. You're going to be picking specific individuals, and then you keep breeding them. Now, those specific individuals were probably picked 300 years ago or so by the king, and that's what's been propagated. And over 90% of all the specific haplotypes that I find here in North America can be derived to those few haplotypes. And when we plot that, we can see that the Old World Eurasia is the derivative of Old World A. And you could be like, well, why does a game farm mallard have an Old World A? Remember where domestication occurred. It was in Europe. So they used European mallards, which would have had Old World A maternal lineages, and that is what is spread. So whether I'm looking at khaki Campbells, call ducks, runner ducks, doesn't really matter what you throw at me. I have not found anything but that in them. And so that also explains that we did domesticate wild mallards in Europe, and that's the lineage of them. In North America, you have this sort of clinal decay from east to west. Remember that the history of stocking practices here in North America, again, as I was starting with, in 1920, they sort of started picking up production on the eastern coast, and they were producing about, as far as literature shows, 500,000 of these things a year until about 1960, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife quotes about 250,000 per year still being pumped out, with 210,000 of those in the Atlantic Flyway. But I'm pretty sure that's a very small number compared to what is really being put on the landscape. And so where we find these maternal lineages and the prevalence of them very much coincide with where game farm releases are, which makes sense. So that means those females that are being released, while they're not supposed to survive and breed, they are to some extent. All right, so this is nuclear, right? So this is analyses of mom and dad, right? And so the first thing I wanted to know is, are the game farm mallards genetically the same thing here as they are in Europe and everywhere else? And yes, they are. They completely overlap in genetic space. And if you go read my paper, we do a bunch of other analyses, and the European game farm mallard is the outgroup to all game farm mallards worldwide. So they are the thing that was picked up and moved, right? Here is where we see all our wild birds, whether I'm looking at Europe or whether I'm looking at here. And then the interesting thing is Greenland mallards do show some genetic differences. Probably some mallards from Europe got to Greenland, stopped migrating, kind of became its own little population. So they're kind of Greenlander mallards. Other folks have also found the same results as well. And then the other domestic things. So park duck, this in case are khaki Campbells that we caught alongside our Mexican ducks when we were banding them. And they've actually proven to be quite important because they're essentially our genetic signature of other domestic birds, right? So other types. So is it always game farm mallards, or maybe mallards are breeding with, park ducks and other stuff? So this gives us a little another reference to compare all our samples. And then Hawaii and New Zealand have diverged because they've been on those islands for a while and for various other reasons I won't get into. The hybrids, of course, aren't between any of those other things. They are between game farm mallards and wild mallards, and they're found in the specific areas as you see here. You can basically see, hopefully, with your eyes, the epicenters of where game farm releases are. Right? So in Europe, you would say it would be France or so. And that's because they, at this point, have been doubling down for about 50 years, and they release about 3 million birds per year to maintain their fall flight. And then it sort of dissipates from that area, right? So it becomes wild there. In North America, we have a similar trend, but it goes from east to west, dissipating as you go east to west. When we zoom in into North America, we can see some additional trends. One of those trends that I'm interested in is finding those hot spots, right? Where's that sort of epicenter? And we have additional methods and to be able to really fine scale, understand whether an individual is early generation hybrid or late generation hybrid. And really, you would expect early generation hybrids in areas where you have game farm and wild mallard continuing to interact, right? Continuing to make babies. And that's over here. And more specifically, it's New Jersey. And then it sort of spreads out. The thing is that most of the Northeast are a bunch of hybrids that I cannot age. That means that's hybrid combinations. The second you have hybrid combinations, that means there's no more wild pool for them to backcross into. And so what you're doing is increasing the chances of a hybrid and a hybrid breeding together. And thus, over time, you should basically have an additive effect of bad genes coming together. And then what you're doing is you're probably creating egg production going from 9 to 8.75 to 8.5 to 8, 7.5. So it's constantly ticking down as more of those individuals interbreed. That trend, of course, declines as you go east to west, but there are some interesting things. So when I did this, I didn't have any telemetry data. I just used genetics to tell me the story, right? So I was like, oh, that's really weird. You've got these areas in a sea of what looks like hybrids, but then you've got the Dakotas, Nebraska, Oklahoma and Kansas. Don't mind those. Again, these are based off of those are a sample size issue. They're like an N of 2. So hopefully those states will provide additional sampling and we can really understand it better. But regardless, you have this situation where you've got generally pure wild mallards in the lower PPR of the Dakotas, and generally wild mallards in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. And so the question is there sort of an innate connectivity between those locations? But then the Great Lakes really look like the Atlantic Flyway. right? The northeastern part of the Atlantic Flyway. So is there a connection with the Atlantic Flyway for the Great Lakes, or what is occurring there? We did additional studies with Brian Davis and Dr. Kaminsky and others to ask that exact question. And indeed, when we went to the lower Mississippi Valley, I can't find hybrids very often. They're about 92% of those birds are just pure wild. And we continue to work with Doug Osborne and Brad Cohen, and they continue to be wild, right? That blows my mind. And remember what I hypothesized of their connectivity. And that's exactly where those birds went. They went to the Dakotas. They have an innate link between those locations that continue to prosper now, right? They want to go back and forth between those locations. I will note those ones that went to the Great Lakes, those are hybrids. What is occurring in the Great Lakes, though, right? So I said the lower part of the Mississippi Valley seems to be mostly wild, but there's something different. There's this meta population dynamic going on. So partnered with Ben Lukanen out of Michigan State, we targeted 591 females across 3 years and asked the question, what do they look like? And it's a completely different situation in the Great Lakes region, right? And this is getting progressively worse since I started studying this about a decade ago. While only 44% on average were considered wild, the rest of them are considered hybrids. Indiana is the worst, as you can see here in red, with all that red. I will say these are breeding females. So this is what the breeding population looks like. But we did do a study in Ohio with hunter harvested birds. And so about the same ratio as the breeding population there as well. I will note that when we look at the Northeast, we see a tick up in wild in the hunter harvest birds. And that's because you got Canada kind of providing these wild birds into the hunter harvest. But when we look at breeding birds, summer birds, of all those states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Maine, I can't find a wild bird they're putting a band on anymore. So what do these birds do? They more or less did a random walk. You could these birds, especially concerning for you guys, right? So the southeastern part of the Atlantic Flyway really got their birds, their mallards, from the partially from the prairie potholes, but really there was a strong connectivity of those late flyers from the Great Lakes region, right? They would hit that upper part of the MAV and cross over into the Southeast Atlantic, and that's what was driving mallard production here, right? That was what your mallard wintering population. And what's happened is these birds are progressively becoming less susceptible to migrate and less able to queue to migrate, period. There is that connection with the Atlantic Flyway, but as you can see, these, if you look closely enough, the points between all the locations is very, very short. They're making these little jotty movements and highly tied to urban areas. Some additional information that we wanted to glean off of this. So on the x-axis, you have genotype, right? So from feral all the way to wild, and you have daily movement. And I hope this graph kind of pops out at you, is that the proportion of game farm ancestry correlates with the distance moved during migration, right? So the more game farm you have, the less steps you make, and those steps are very short. Not only that, but there was a significant correlation in feral and those less than 70% wild birds having 2 times greater selection of urban land cover than wild mallards. And I won't show you the results, but Ben's going to be publishing this stuff soon, and he's about to defend in a couple weeks or 3 weeks or so. But wild mallards were 3.3 times more likely to incubate and complete nesting on the landscape. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio with anything that's got less than 70% wild versus a wild bird, right? So for every 3 wild birds that would have completed nesting, only 1 of these things actually completes it. And it's typically an urban cover. And I will tell you that these things start nesting, but what happens typically is that they get off nest within 2 weeks. Ben sends a tech out there, be like, what happened to the nest? It's not usually predation, although predation occurs eventually, but she simply leaves. The nest is usually half baked, and there are eggs essentially not, there'll be a couple eggs inside where the nest bowl is, but then there's eggs basically strewn about the locations. So yeah, so the question was always, how do we get old world mallards here or old world female genetics here and all that good stuff? Well, we brought them here. And more or less, it's essentially a feral population, a feral pig issue, more or less. Some additional general differences, right? So they're about 5 to 10% different. An American black duck and the wild mallard is 1.5% different. These are 5 to 10 times that of what an American black duck is from a wild mallard. That's what domestication does, right? That's what artificial selection, that kind of captive breeding does. And somebody asked me, or somebody made the note at some point, and they're like, yeah, but interbreeding between groups should actually increase diversity. And I said, yes, if both groups are diverse. And the problem with domestication is it typically leads to lost diversity. And when you have an inbred line and you breed it with an outbred line, something that has diversity, what you should see is actually more inbred individuals that you're producing. So I told my PhD student who's graduating in 3 weeks to do another chapter. And we have full genomes in a bunch of these birds. There's only a few here, but we're putting 150 of this and 50 birds onto these graphs here soon. And the correlations are more remarkable than I thought. The first one that you're seeing, so we did a whole bunch of assessments of looking at diversity in different ways. This is called runs of homozygosity. It's basically how large is the island of your genome that has no diversity, that you've completely lost. And what you can see is a straight up correlation. As things become more and more feral or more game farmy, they have more of these islands. And of course, this leads to declining nucleotide diversity, so another estimate of overall diversity of your genome. But more importantly, what this leads to is individuals that have more game farm in them are simply more inbred. So the pairing between a wild and a game farm mallard are simply creating more inbred individuals on the landscape. And this, of course, sort of explains lots of things that we are now starting to find and publish on. And so first of all, fertility, right? Fertility of a domestic bird versus a wild bird are completely different. We need production, and that's what we attain with these things. If you put these things on Purina chow, I can make them make 100 eggs. We had these birds in captivity for captive breeding, not captive breeding, but a feeding trial. And so we would take food away, then force them to eat on wild seed. And I'll show you some of that initially. And then we put them back on a high fat diet to get their body weight back. While a pure wild mallard should be about 900 to 1200 grams, these birds are typically 700 to 900 grams, and we can't make them fatter. They will not put fat on them for one reason or another. So physiologically have been changed to not be able to do that. And so some of these traits you put on the wild, you should see decreased survival, right? A bird that doesn't cue into migration, doesn't know where it's going, can't put fat on, doesn't typically survive very well. And our European colleagues have found that across the pond, as well as hopefully some of Ben's work is really showcasing that as you increase the influence of game farm in these birds, you decrease their ability to even cue into migratory behavior. Again, as I just mentioned, their growth and body weights are completely different. I have a master student looking at flight muscles. Apparently we have changed their flight muscle from slow twitch to fast twitch. Doesn't really matter what that means, but a sprinter would have more fast twitch muscles where they can really just get going, but it's for short distances. A person who's a marathoner would have more slow twitch muscle fibers where they're able to maintain distance. And so slow twitch, it would be what we have in migratory mallards, and fast twitch would be something that would be a bit more flightier, I guess. Bill morphology and lamella density. We continue to study this, but we basically more or less on the game farm mallard in red, green is wild mallards all the way on the right. Blue is the known hybrids. And the first thing is what we found is that they have shorter and wider bills. So we've shortened it and widened the bills. And you can see hybrids kind of do that nice, tending to this intermediacy of the two parents. Wings are actually shorter, so they have a shorter aspect ratio. So you took a jumbo jet and you put fighter jet wings on it. you took the fuel away. And so you're able to make these maneuvers a little bit better, and they are flightier birds. However, they are not able to sustain that flight, would be my hypothesis. And the telemetry data really showcases that, actually. But the interesting thing is that hybrids are statistically the same as mallards. That means Mother Nature, this is the first thing Mother Nature is trying to get rid of, are those wing patterns of these types of birds. That means a hybrid that can't, any individual with really short wings, those things must be dying on the landscape immediately. Tarsus, they have longer legs. The only time I ever see this is in an island species that's becoming flightless, right? So they have longer legs compared to our wild mallards, generally speaking. And so more or less the way I see this, and we can make all sorts of stories, but this is the way I see it. Regardless, this is this is what it turned out to be. But you can imagine for 450 years, you're throwing breadcrumbs or whatever you're doing into a cage. The thing that could run and peck would actually eat more and be your prize duck than the thing that's trying to waddle over and trying to filter feed. So over 450 years of domestication, we made something that's more like a chicken than it is a duck. And those bills are actually transformed to peck. They're really good when I give them corn. When I force them to eat wild seeds, they're not so great, right? So left side is wild, right side is game farm mallards, males in red, females in blue. Generally speaking, they have a 50% reduction in feeding efficiency of wild seeds, inverts, and so forth. So when you change a golf course or a corn stand to a beautiful wetland, you're actually decreasing carrying capacity of that bird. The worst of them is the female mallard that has 70% reduction in its feeding capacity of wild seeds. So that bill morphology does have a mechanistic and a consequence to birds on the landscape. So this isn't like entirely new, right? We know what domestication can do, and it can do it very quickly. That's what artificial selection. I mean, somebody could just ask, how is that even possible? And I just say, how's it even possible that I took a wolf and I made a Chihuahua, right? It is possible. You can force the issue by these selective breeding programs. And the problem is if you don't influence those wild genes into these things, like we've learned in fisheries, and like I started in fisheries, actually working on trout and whatnot. So if you don't do this in fisheries, bobwhite, pheasants, and so forth, what you're doing is you're putting a bunch of individuals that are making it in a cage because you're allowing him to make it, because everybody wins in a cage, but not everybody wins in nature, in the wild. So I wasn't going to show this, but I thought this would be interesting because I saw Belrose 76 publication that Dr. Kaminsky sent me. I'm like, holy moly, these dates really line up with what we found. My student, Lauren McFarland, is asking the question, how did this happen? Thank God for duck hunters. Thank God we've been hunting ducks for since we could catch them, right? Because duck hunters like to shoot ducks and they like to put them into museums. So what we did was we partnered with 27 national museums, and we got mallards from 1800 to today, every single flyway, every decade, and asked the question, how much game farm mallard ancestry was on the landscape during that time? Below that dotted line would be something that I would consider wild. Anything above it was statistically significant amounts of game farm ancestry on the landscape. So we'll start with the Pacific Flyway. You see that nice little bump in the 20s? The Central Flyway basically said, nah, we have plenty of mallards. We do not want to deal with game farm mallards. The Mississippi Flyway has several different bumps, and they correspond with the 20s and those 40s through the 70s and currently. And this is what the Atlantic Flyway looks like. Quite stark, but you can see that nice 1920s when we first started attempting these things. Apparently, my hypothesis would be that people are like, oh, this is a good idea, but we need production to really ramp up. So they probably took a bit to figure out the right cages, feeding guilds, and all that to really get production up. So in about 10 years, though, Mother Nature essentially turned all the 4 flyways back into wild. Problem is the production really started going from the 40s through the 70s. Obviously, something happened right after the 70s. Production actually came down, which ties quite well into what we know. There was a lot more of these things being put on the landscape up through the 60s. And then it sort of started to half that number, whether it's 500 to 250 or 1,000,000 to 500. But there was a decline in the total number of these birds being put, which corresponds with this as well. And while Mother Nature pushed the Mississippi flyway at some in the 80s back to wild, the Atlantic flyway could no longer come back down. That is when hybrid combinations became prevalent. And you essentially, what this shows me is by the 80s, there was no significant amount of wild stock left, breeding stock in the Atlantic flyway per se. And again, again, Belrose sort of estimated about 150,000 wintering mallards in South Carolina in 1976. And it was about in the 80s and 90s that you started to probably see this slow trickle of less and less birds. And that actually corresponds with this hybrid swarm formation and then the increasing trends generally more recently in the 2000s of these birds, and all four flyways are starting to peak up with these birds. So unfortunately, someone in all four flyways is considering these birds on the landscape. All right. So South Carolina, back when I did this study, we had about 20, 25 birds. I was like, oh, that's interesting. You've got a little bit of everything. When we plot that out, this is sort of what it looked like at the time. And I shared this information with Mark Johnson. And he's like, we really need to figure out what we're shooting here, right? Where are the wild birds? Maybe wild birds like certain areas, and game farm birds are fairly things like these other areas. So he came to me and we came up with this project that I'm going to touch on, but I do want to showcase this, which is the only other study that I know of recent times for South Carolina. We did a North Carolina study as well and found similar trends, but this was mostly about mottled ducks, right? And I just wanted to show you, if you never looked at these are assignment probabilities. If you ever done 23andMe or Ancestry.com, they paint your chromosome of, German, Irish, Russian, whatever. This is what that is. So if you're painted one color, you're that group. If you're painted multiple colors, you're a combination of groups, right? And so what we found is that while both Western Gulf Coast and Florida mottled ducks were brought here, it was Western Gulf Coast that made it here. For one reason or another, Florida did not contribute into that pool. The other part is that we did get game farm mallards from a couple breeders here in South Carolina, and we've refined this a lot more. They are both of game farm mallard origin. One of them did interbreed wild stock into them, and all of those birds are about 80% game farm, 20% wild. They're just making 80-20 babies, which is interesting in itself. All right, so how did we do in year one, right? Awesome participation. I never know how these types of things are going to go, how hunters are going to respond and all that. But thanks to Mark and Jim's efforts and other efforts, we really got the word out. 39 locations, 379 tongues, 100% of all the vials that did have a tongue, they worked. Several vials came in with data, but no tongue, so we can't really get DNA out of nothing. 378 of them were mallard-like ducks. One of them was a wood duck mallard, wild mallard hybrid. That was cool to see. Yeah, so at this point, we're working with about 17 to 20,000 markers. This is on par with 23andMe and Ancestry.com. That's why we've really refined our ability to identify things. We still wanted to look at that maternal lineage and what's happening on the landscape. So we did mitochondrial DNA and asked the question, how much of these old world birds are female lineages are here versus what should be here, which is just simply North American New World birds. So this is another, that kind of space thing. Black are the khaki Campbell. You can see how distinguishable they are from game farm mallards in red, or even wild mallards in green. You can see how closely related black ducks are in purple. And then Western Gulf Coast mottled ducks are pretty distinct from all those guys. And then gray are the 378 mallard-like ducks, right? You see that nice splattering between mallard black duck and game farm, and then lots of Western Gulf Coast birds. And then that one in the middle turned out to be an American black duck mottled duck hybrid. So when we plot that on the landscape, this is what it looks like. You've got orange is mottled ducks, the pure mottled ducks, coastal, makes sense. You've got sort of a splattering of mallards and black ducks and hybrids all over the place. And we'll kind of get into it each one of those in a second. But as you can see, the proportion of samples were highly skewed towards mallard stuff, which is what I expected because that's what we asked for. When we just generally look at the total number of hybrids within, like, amongst mallards or black ducks or mottled ducks, you can see that mallards had the largest proportion of those things being of hybrid origin, followed by black ducks and then mottled ducks being with that one hybrid only. So yeah, maternally, right? So we did pick up Old World and New World. So Old World on the right there, those same 14 balls that we find all over the world. Or so. And then you've got the New World on the left, lots of little balls found all over the world. You can actually see, I just noticed it, the mottled ducks, you could see that that only a few females actually were brought here and made it, and they've been the maternal lineage to your mottled ducks, apparently. I'll have to look at that a little bit more. Anyways, hunters did shoot five feral game farm mallards. I have to call them feral because I don't know when they escaped, right? It's kind of like you shot a pig and did it get out of Bob's yard today, or was it there for a decade and now I shot it? So I just have to call it feral. So that's what they are. Feral mallards, and of course, all five of them just correspond to those two balls there. So they're the same maternal lineage again that has been propagated and moved about the world. This I thought was interesting, the proportion of Old World and New World, that A and B. When we look at just generally pure black ducks or mottled ducks, they tend to stay away, right? They are picking correctly. They are assortatively mating with their types over and over and over. It's when they become hybrids that become a problem, where we see that influence of game farm female ancestry in those groups, except for wild mallards. So this is something that has back crossed enough where genetically, right, their 23andMe is wild, but their maternal lineage still has that signature, that great grandma was probably a game farm mallard. So we can also figure out, did they have game farm ancestry sometime in their past this way? All right, so getting to all the species, these are mottled ducks, right? 52 samples, 51 of them were just mottled ducks. One of them was American black duck, mottled duck hybrid. It was found there. You can see the one ball with the yellow squiggle there. But 98% of them, pure wild mottled ducks. Blows my mind that you still have them. They must be mate pairing as early as September, October, is like we see with Mexican ducks and other mottled ducks in Texas. And so when the influence of those wintering birds come, they must be pair bonded already, that they're not being influenced by mallards as much as, let's say, black ducks are, right? So these are black ducks, about 48 samples. 69% of black duck samples were genetically pure, which was really great to see, actually. And then you had these hybrid combinations, either simply a black duck with a wild mallard, but something that we have been learning in duck DNA, and I should have thought about this and I just didn't, but there are these three gene pool combinations: black duck, wild mallard, and game farm. So that black duck mated with a wild game farm mallard hybrid. So these game farm genes are not just a complication for wild mallards, but they are a complication for other species, including the black duck. But with our program with DU, Duck DNA, at that national level, we're starting to see that also in brewer's ducks and other things that are other hybrids and other species being influenced by game farm genes. All right, so mallards, largest number of birds, lots of them pure. I was actually quite surprised, pleasantly surprised. 57% were wild. I thought it'd be just like a whole bunch of feral birds. But 41% were game farm wild mallard hybrids, and only 2%, again, those 5 samples all the way on the left there, were simply feral mallards. Interestingly enough, these are the locations that shot game farm mallards, and they sort of correspond with the locations I had about a decade ago. So why that is, I don't know. You probably all do, knowing where the game farm releases are or who practices it. Maybe this makes sense. One interesting aspect, I will say, there's lots of analyses that I can do. Honestly, this is the fastest we've ever done 400 samples. We only got, Mark provided these in March. We were backed up by 1,000 samples with other studies. We finally got to it. I got then we got backed up with sequencing. I only got this stuff in April 15th. So I did this in 2 weeks. I've never done that in my entire life. So I was like, all right, we got all my computers working. And so I was like, all right, what else can we ask? So these are sort of the initial thoughts that I had, but there's plenty of other questions that we can ask. And the first thing is there a change across the months? And as you can see here, you have a spike in game farm ancestry in November and January. I don't know what that means, but it obviously, maybe November is local production and January is the influence of those migrators coming in, bringing those genes onto the landscape. Don't know. We wanted to do a more refined analysis. We did do a heat map analysis, but I also learned that it is data hungry, more so about locations than it is about number of samples in any one location. So now I've learned that instead of doing 50 samples in one location, I would rather have 5 samples of 10 locations, but more spread out. That being said, we did find a significant correlation between landscape and game farm mallard ancestry here in Georgetown. This was the one significant one. Again, we're going to need more years, at least 1 or 2 more years to figure out, not only to fill in some of those geographical gaps for the analytical side, but also see, is this pattern hold, right? So is this year in and year out? Is this what we're seeing? So what did we learn? Your model ducks stay at model ducks. That's a surprising and interesting conservation story, right? It's a translocation event that resulted in a self-sustaining population of model ducks in their western Gulf Coast. So if Texas ever loses too many model ducks, maybe they'll come back here to grab some. American black ducks, generally equal chance of harvesting a black duck in the state, including hybrids. Sample size is not very large, so I can't make any specific determinants. So we would require more sampling if we wanted to go down that path. Mallards, no evident difference again in the chance of harvesting a wild or hybrid mallard in South Carolina. So we didn't see any sort of primary location that was statistically better than any other place, except for Georgetown. We did find that kind of hotspot there. Again, it's weak due to sampling effort and locations, but it's there. Again, about 60% of these birds are wild, which is phenomenal, which is really great. The other part of this is that the majority, 80% of your hybrids are actually above that 70% threshold where we start to see these birds being wild, morphologically wild, behaviorally wild, right? That lineage essentially reconstituted wild at that point. It seems, right? So my question is there a group of birds, probably in Western Michigan, that is sort of hedging their way back towards wild, that is starting to migrate over, right? Where are those birds coming from? Like my hypothesis would be that those are migrators. And then my hypothesis would be that the left side of them, the ones that are trend actually towards game farm, that means that's a bird that was going wild and then bred with a game farm that's on the landscape, is potentially local production. Right. So then the question becomes really, what do we do in the future? So my thoughts is that you need at least 2 years, minimum 3 years is really great to see pattern, right? How strong is this pattern? Does this hold year in and year out? And if so, then we can start thinking about what this means for habitat and the population dynamics that's going on in South Carolina, but also across the nation. What those November, January spikes are, right? So one of my thoughts is you can either figure out what the best thing is to do summer sampling and winter sampling. So you really know what your migrator pool is and what your breeding pool is. But really, you only need summer sampling to do it. So if we can catch some birds and understand what the gene pool is and the contribution of those birds during the summer, so what is the local production, we can subtract that from fall harvest and figure out migrators, right? So we can just take out that piece of the puzzle. The other part of it is I think that we should do a telemetry study. I know there's a telemetry study. I'm not privy to it. Unfortunately, they decided not to take genetics, although I think that would have really at least provided information for them. But something in January, February to make sure that those birds at least survive for 3-4 months so we can figure out, do they leave? And if they leave, where did they go? Just to find where the heck those, those ones that are carrying those less than 70% or more than 70% or sorry, less than 30% game farm in them, right? So are they basically reconstituting their ability to queue and move about the country? Again, none of those 591 birds from Ben Lukanen's work actually made it. That's not true. One did, came to the border, and then quickly went back to Tennessee and north. But otherwise, they're short stopping for one reason or another. But really, when you look at the distance moved of those birds compared to the birds from the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, they're very short. So they're just making these hops to wherever the heck they can find a meal, right? They're losing too much energy is how I see it. And it's very much corresponding to the work that physiological work that we're doing and what the anecdotal stuff that we have currently. So again, doing more sampling around feral game farm locations to determine contribution. Contribution, I think that we can refine that heat map and potentially, you know, if all of you or some of you and the federal agencies are interested, more or less the way I see this is if we do nothing, then at minimum, we just need to bring their survival as close to zero as possible, right? So potentially having special hunts in WMAs close to those regions that we can say you could shoot 10 mallards and just bring that probability of that individual making it past that zero as possible. What is the breeding population, as I noted, of mallards and mallard-like ducks? The summer sampling, I'm pretty sure that American black duck mottled duck hybrid was actually born here because we saw the same exact thing, not between them, but between black ducks and mallards, local producing mallards in North Carolina. So I'm pretty sure that was locally grown and somebody got a cool duck. With that, I want to really thank Mark Johnson, Dr. Kaminsky for really starting this project, moving this forward. Jim, getting on board, getting all of you on board, providing funding. Most of all, if you were a hunter that participated or a landowner or anybody else, I really want to thank all of you. It would not be possible. This is the first time we've ever attempted something like this. I think there's been really great interest, really great support. I hope we can get a second and potentially a third year out of this and really actually make South Carolina as the leader of what we do if we want to ask these questions at the state level. With that, I want to thank you all for listening. On the left, there's that QR code. Hopefully it works for the South Carolina report. It's not as refined as I'd like, but I was also printing these things on Friday, right before Mother's Day and right before I left off to come here on Monday. So you can pick that up. If UTEP for some reason denies you, please email me and I'll just send it to you. I think there's some copies out there, but easiest way to do that. And then my lab there and anybody that's watching this that is interested in contributing with funding or anything else that would make this possible. Because again, the way this was made possible is through private donations. This paid for my technician's time. This paid for all of the lab time. You know, it's $50 a sample, right? And some people are like, wow, that's a lot of money. Yeah, this used to be hundreds of dollars. If you ever worked with a geneticist in the 90s or early 2000s, you probably blew through a bunch of money and got data 10 years down the road. And you were like, this is useless to me. So I hope this shows you where we are, that this data could really contribute at a management level within seasons. And as you can see, within a month of getting just tons in the freezer, right? We got all this data and all these analyses that you could actually start implementing in the field and using that information as knowledge to better make management decisions. With that, thank you again for all of you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
If you had the genetics from the Dakotas, that's an original, and you had that in the game farms.
Yes.
And you could eventually get that spread to other game farms, make it a law. What effect would that have on the genetics? Would it reverse?
Yeah. So that's I love that question. We had the same exact question. So this is going to be the long version of an answer that eventually gets to the answer. This is the same thing. The thing here is happening in Hawaii, right? So I'm partnered in Hawaii, and the Hawaiians are like, all right, They're all hybrid swarms. We only have this endangered species, the Hawaiian duck on Kauai. Socially irresponsible to nuke everybody anymore. So what do? So I said, all right, let's try this. Let's artificially move individuals in a management effort to actually see if we can artificially push the genetics towards what we want. They said, great, we can't do that until you have a model. So I had one of my students create a model. It's an adaptive management kind of model where we have a whole bunch of biological factors. And then you say, I have a genetic ancestry of 70%, right? I have, and your management strategies are supplementation and or removal. And then you ask, can I move the needle given my limited resources, which is either time or number of birds, whatever that limiting resource is, can I move the needle? Theoretically, yes, you can. And our models show that. We just obtained 2 years. We do need another year. So if anybody wants to provide about $250,000, we could finish this off proper. But I just hired 3 people to start this. Our first translocation events are supposed to happen in May. So we'll have a brood in come July, August, right? And then I'll be able to look at the genetic ancestry of those kids and ask the question, did we move the needle, right? And the beauty about this is that those kids and the genetic ancestry is what feeds our models back. If we did not hit what the model suggests that the next generation should be, then we can ask the question, which of these biological and ecological traits, so fecundity, survival, female mortality, sex ratios, whatever it might be off, right? So, but if we did hit it, great. Then we ask the model, what is the total number of birds we have to move and remove to hit the next level? Now, the beauty is that our model suggests that we could do this in about 3 generations. And as you can see here, we can revert, like the empirical data shows that we can reverse that genetic signature quite quickly. That's 3 to 4 years in mallard world, in duck world.
One other question, I'll leave you alone. If that is a solution,
yes,
that makes sense. Why don't we work on the solution rather than beating the problem all to death?
Great question. Beating the problem half to death. That's because most people just have been closing their ears and asking me, where's the data? So here's some data. Sorry that graduate students don't publish fast enough, but we will have this done in a year or so. The solution is correct. There's no way we're going to move that many birds out of the Dakotas into the Atlantic Flyway that is essentially lacking a population. You can't do anything if you've got nothing, right? We have to reinvigorate that stock, quote unquote stock, more or less. So in my mind, this is a perfect situation where we could work with people who know how to raise these birds, but in a way where we can monitor for their genetic ancestry, make sure that inbreeding coefficient stays wild, make sure the genetic ancestry stays wild. Because honestly, when you bring things into a cage, you inadvertently are already domesticating. We know that in trout and bobwhite, it takes about 3 generations, and you've lost 50% in your fecundity, right? Number of viable eggs. And so it's very quick that these things become an issue. So you're right. I think this is a perfect kind of partnership because we're going to need a whole bunch of birds, in my mind. Haven't run the models yet, but if Hawaii actually works where we have full control, right, then Hawaii is actually going to expand that across the islands as their management strategy. But that also means that we can start devising and modeling what it would really take here in North America, because this is an island and a continent. It's quite different, but it's going to take a whole bunch of birds, and we're going to need help with that. Is how I see it as well.
We see that works as well. There's just a lot of people
Well,
who've got to get
I
on.
can tell you, rather, you don't want to capture the birds because you're bringing in disease. I mean, there's a lot of subtypes, viral subtypes in these wild birds. What you want is the eggs.
Yeah.
And if we can hatch the eggs, if you could get 5,000 eggs, you could replace a breeder flock the size of ours.
Yeah, and
assuming you get a decent hatch.
And you can, because we moved eggs. We wanted to ask all that feeding stuff. So we caught Keith Hagee provided wild birds out of Forbes Biological Station. But then we also went to California, did egg salvage from their egg salvage program. We brought those in because we wanted to be like, okay, what if it's a bird that's never been on the landscape? Does it still eat like a wild bird, right? A wild bird eats like a wild bird just from birth. And the answer is yes. But the important thing for you is that we brought those things as eggs and we got, I forget what Panola was able to do, but I'm pretty sure it was like 89% hatch. Because we had over 100 birds in these locations that we were doing all these trials with. So it worked out quite well. So it is possible. And I think that especially with Cal Waterfowl having that egg salvage program, that's one location. We can obviously genetically vet everybody because I know Metzger does release and I do find their genetics on the landscape. It blows my mind sometimes. But the thing is that we have tools that we can almost in real time, right? Give me a couple weeks, but almost in real time tell you like that, dispatch that one, breed that. I mean, it's a breeding operation, right? Make sure you breed that one and that one. Zoos do this all the time to make sure they have higher diversity than the number of individuals that they have. And I think that's something that we could do. Yeah.
Overall, I feel like this looks pretty bleak. Knowing everything that you know now, what do you think are some lessons already learned that state agencies, federal agencies, wetland managers, whatever, could implement that you think would lead more towards what you would want to see?
Well, the first thing is actually just figuring out how many birds are actually being released. We need that number for our own models because that's essentially the opposite trend of what we want to do. Assuming that all breeders all of a sudden just decide to do what we hope they would do, that and work with us, that'd be one thing. But what the state agency, so Michigan DNR just put, I think, stamp dollars. Don't quote me on that. Oh, now I'm on video. Some sort of dollars. But they are doing a 3-year study. Basically, they want to redo this, but they also put a person on staff to actually start just figuring out where are these breeders, where are the locations, what is occurring on the landscape, right? Every state is essentially its own rules, and most states don't have any rules as far as we have found for these things, because technically they're not protected in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So certain states are just like, these aren't ours. You have to talk to USDA. Other states do have some rules. It's completely different. There is nothing. So in my opinion, that's like the first step. And we do have a graduate student just trying to get that information, where it's just like with Mike Schumer, one of his master students, essentially calling, being like, how many birds are you releasing, just to understand what's happening on the landscape. It takes a massive amount of birds with that 3 to 5% survival rate to do this. But it's not impossible, obviously, because if you did this for 100 years, this is what we've got, right? And somebody would be like, well, how is that possible? I was like, I don't know. There's a billion passenger pigeons. I guess you just need 1 billion and 1 shots, and you could do something with that. So anything's so, and obviously in Europe, it's the same thing. And I will note a couple of the Scandinavian countries, and one of them, Sweden, has already put a moratorium, a 10-year moratorium, telling their breeders they have 10 years to figure out what they're going to do. And then I understand that Norway is having similar talks. How they got that through or why, I'm not privy to that, but they are starting with that for that. I think importantly, we need this information published so we can have that discussion, so people can stop telling me that there is no data out there for this. And then working with state and federal agencies to understand what's actually happening on the landscape, because potentially it's not every state, right? What it looks like to me is that the majority is the places that I see the worst part would be like France, Jersey, and the Great Lakes all look the same, this signature. And the only way to do that is that you're constantly pumping out birds, right? Natural selection is trying to parse those out, but the total number of birds putting on the landscape versus what it can parse out is not equal, right? It's overweight on it. And on top of it, the complex urban, rural areas, as you can see, they're obviously increasing their survival and to some extent able to make some eggs and hatch them successfully in a more urban area, because they are obviously picking that. And that's probably because they're not surviving in more rural areas, right? And so, God, that was a winded answer to your question. I'm not sure. That's a long conversation over a lot of beer, but yeah, I think the first thing is just getting a baseline of what's occurring on the landscape and trying to actually get to a point where maybe we could at minimum say, hey, if you're gonna put these birds out, put your name and the year on a band them, right? So every bird you throw out, so at least we can watch where they're going, right? How many, what proportion of them, you know, you threw out 7,000, maybe 100 of them were shot. Asking what is the real rate of these birds getting loose, surviving just long enough. And on top of it, if birds are being banned, recaught during the summer, then you could see how many of those birds are actually making it into the breeding pool, right? And we can start asking those questions. And if a breeder's like, that's too many bands, you could just be like, well, if somebody shoots it, if they don't want the band, you can just keep reusing, because it's going to be a name and a year just to figure out where those birds are going, how long they survive, and so forth. Yeah, yeah, did that answer it?
Yeah, it kind of, it's interesting to know that. I feel like we know what the problem is. You know, what can we do to tackle it? Is basically.
And the reason that you're not getting a straight answer is because I'm on recording. But
Fair enough.
but as I will say, look, I don't create laws. I'm not a state or federal employee. I provide data. Just like a taxonomist would tell me not to call things, just provide them phylogenies and they can figure that stuff out. I provide data, and it's up to legislators, or however that process works, which I don't even understand. However that works, that would actually take the next step.
So I'm gonna ask the Fish and Wildlife Service question and take Jim's question and merge the two, but how can, as far as the harvest regulations, more liberal often means more released birds, less, or more restrictive is less birds, maybe potentially. Just looking at the economics, so how do you use that to influence potentially some work where you're bringing in, you know, North Dakota birds, and you're working it towards a more liberalized harvest, but you're also using that as a driver.
That's just a different strategy, I think.
Yeah.
It's the same strategy, it's just.
Well, I mean, none of this can happen until Fish and Wildlife and the states go through their approval processes and allow us to even take wild birds, right? So the reason that game farm mallards are able to be sold, bought, done however you want, including shot as many as you want in particular. So I've learned that this isn't always the case, but there are several states where between 10 and 2, you could shoot there. Apparently there's no wild mallards or birds flying around, because between 10 and 2, you could shoot and release as many as you want. And I know this because we were able to get 30 birds. To get 30 birds, they released 100 birds. And where those 70 other birds went were WMAs, most of them. And so, yeah, so it would require conversations within the feds and the states to start asking the question, what kind of rule changes would this require, right? Because there is a clause that came out last year that said even 1% wild is now under the jurisdiction of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This year it's gone, because that's a complication. If you have 1% in your flock, that means you are done, right? Technically. So that it's sort of like having your cake and eating it. Now, if we work within the system and say, for this purpose, we're going to amend whatever rules that are in the books. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why that isn't the path forward. Again, we're about 50 years behind Europe. Right? And what they have to do to shoot mallards is more or less a trout pond. And that's a problem in my mind. Because again, there is no, in my mind, you know, you could say like, well, why they do this? Nobody knew that this was going to happen. When I was an undergrad at Davis, Johnny, you told me they're not a problem either. And I was never looking for this, right? The problem is that if they don't survive and don't breed, then they shouldn't have any babies, and I shouldn't find their genetics, but they're clearly worldwide. So clearly this group of birds, as compared to khaki Campbells or Peking ducks or Rowans, or this, if you ever go to a park and it's just a mess of these things, for whatever reason, those things don't interbreed, right? It's just this breed that is capable and able to, and it's most likely because it still looks like a mallard to some extent, but obviously, hopefully the data I provided strongly suggests that it doesn't act like a wild mallard. Only looks that way. Yeah.
Did you hear about the wood duck male and the mallard female that created a brood of children, but the children didn't make? Did you hear about that in Central Park?
I didn't hear about that. But
It's one of those anecdotal murder observation things that happen.
well, so we did get that wood duck wild mallard hybrid here that was an adult, and the female lineage was wood duck. So it was a female wood duck with a male wild mallard that made that brood. So, and that's not the only one. Through duck DNA, we found several others. So they do survive. And to be fair, birds aren't the best like reproductively isolated group. If you look at any sort of bird group, and there's various reasons genetically why this happens, but they simply don't like completely become reproductively isolated, especially if you bring them to captivity. I mean, there's several studies that, I mean, almost all ducks can make hybrids, and as far as we can tell, and through duck DNA again, we're finding many of them on the landscape at least this year, hopefully next year too. But yeah, they're happening. To what rate? I don't know, right? I did have an interesting thought. As mallard numbers fluctuate, right? So it's male biased populations. And there's some modeling that's going on that's showing that male bias is increasing. I wonder with more male mallards on the landscape, because I swear a mallard would mate with me if it could. I wonder if hybridization rates also fluctuate with changing ratios through time. But something, again, I'm interested. Hopefully duck DNA will continue. Hopefully these types of studies continue and we can start asking those kinds of questions. Anything else? 3, 2, 1, sold.
Can I just interject one thing for everybody? It is our intention that this meeting is being recorded. We are going to then take this recording, send to all participants in all of these meetings across the state. We're going to send a link to this. So the people that were invited couldn't attend, they'll have the option to be able to review all this. All the people who would like to or think that would be interested in this, we're going to make that available to them. In addition to that, we're going to try to put links to some interesting scientific studies, some links to things that you can be doing in the habitat area to improve your habitat for wild mallards and other water birds as well. So it's just going to kind of be an information link to everybody, but that's in the plans as a follow-up item back to everybody.
One last thing. I will tell you that my group is working on a AI app that essentially we built the brain. We need an app developer and $300,000. So again, if anybody's listening or anybody here interested in partnering, but the idea is that we're training this thing with genetically vetted pictures. And we're already getting 100% discrimination between a game farm and a wild with this, with putting these pictures through our brain, right? We're getting 92% accuracy for anything that's got less than 60%, which is pretty damn good, right? So we can discriminate between a simply feral bird, a simply wild bird, and at least those highly backcross stuff. What I think that this is going to be a management game changer. In particular, one, it standardizes the way individuals your banding crews are identifying birds in the landscape. We currently have a 3-species model ducks, Mexican ducks, and mallards, and we're putting game farm mallards into here. We just don't have the data sets built up enough to get really good statistical analyses. That being said, we can discriminate between all of them. The app essentially is going to give you species, age, sex, plumage, and genetic probability, right? So every band crew will be able to essentially standardize the way they're doing it. But on top of it, if we get this into the hunter's hands, which would have to work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife state partners, if they're using it, that's time and date and location stamped pictures of individuals with probability. And you essentially have telemetry data for the fall flight across the nation if everybody's taking these pictures, and we're looking at what these different birds are doing at what time. Of course, we can build this out for Gadwell and Widgeon and teal and whatever. Because once the brain is there, it's just a matter of teaching what this is. On top of it, in my mind, if we do nothing, at minimum in locations that allow it, and of course, with federal and state agency backing, potentially this is a management tool where if you use it and you take a picture and it just says you shot a feral mallard, then it's a way to maybe manage that by saying that doesn't count against your bag, because technically that bird did not count against the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, since it's a game farm mallard that you just shot. I might be speaking out of my way, but that is a thought of way to potentially manage the situation, and a way to get hunters to participate in that. And I imagine hunters would be happy to, but I'm sure there's a lot of other issues, bureaucratic issues that I'm not thinking of, but you know, I'll live in my world. But again, I think that would, at minimum, standardize the way that banding crews are identifying individuals. And on top of it, when we're banding, then you can actually assign those bands as feral, wild, and hybrid, and actually ask the questions in IPM modeling or anything else, asking, separate those out. Is there statistical difference in survival and so forth? Just another way to monitor this at a national level, I think.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lavretsky.
All right, thank you all.